Squirrel listeners, I owe you an apology. I'm so sorry I didn't read yesterday. By the time I thought of it, the teeth had already come out and I was in my jammies. I'll try to read extra today, although, of course, I forgot something to drink right here. Okay, here we go. Okay, they were talking about concert. Let me just go back right here. The concert plan afforded excellent opportunities for doing this, and evening after evening she slipped away to practice her songs upstairs while Archie sat staring disconsolately at the neglected work basket and mute piano. Rose pitied him and longed to say a word of comfort, but felt shy. He was such a reserved fellow, so left him to conduct his quiet wooing in his own way, feeling that the crisis would soon arrive. She was sure of this as she sat beside him on the evening of the concert, for while the rest of the family nodded and smiled, chatted and laughed in great spirits, Archie was as mute as a fish and sat with his arms tightly folded as if to keep any unruly emotions which might attempt to escape. He never looked at the program, but Rose knew when Phoebe's turn came by the quick breath he drew and the intent look so absent before that came into his eyes. But her own excitement prevented much notice of his, for Rose was in a flutter of hope and fear, sympathy and delight about Phebe and her success. The house was crowded, the audience sufficiently mixed to make the general opinion impartial, and the stage full of little orphans with shining faces, a most effective reminder of the object in view. Little dears, how nice they look, poor things, so young to be fatherless and motherless. It will be a disgrace to the city if those girls are not taken proper care of. Subscriptions are always in order, you know, and pretty Miss Campbell will give you her sweetest smile if you hand her a handsome check. I've heard this Phebe more, and she really has a delicious voice. Such a pity she won't fit herself for opera. Only sings 3 times tonight. That's modest, I'm sure, when she's the chief attraction. So we must give her an encore after the Italian piece. The orphans lead off, I see. Stop your ears if you like, but don't fail to applaud, or the ladies will never forgive you. Chat of this sort went on briskly while fans waved, programs rustled, and ushers flew about distractedly till an important gentleman appeared, made his bow, skipped upon the leader's stand, and with a wave of his baton caused a general uprising of white pinafores as the orphans led off with that much adjuring melody, America, in shrill small voices, but with creditable attention to time and tune. Pity and patriotism produced a generous round of applause, and the little girl sat down beaming with innocent satisfaction. An instrumental piece followed, and then a youthful gentleman with his hair in picturesque confusion and what his friends called a musical brow bounded up the steps, and clutching a roll of music with a pair of tightly gloved hands, proceed to inform the audience in a husky tenor voice that it was a lovely violet. A lovely violet. What else the song contained in the way of sense or sentiment it was impossible to discover, as the 3 pages of music appeared to consist of variations upon that one line, ending with a prolonged quaver which flushed the musical brow and left the youth quite breathless when he made his bow. "Now she's coming. Oh, Uncle, my heart beats as if it were myself," whispered Rose, clutching Dr. Alec's arm with a little gasp as the piano was rolled forward, the leader's stand pushed back, and all eyes turned toward the anteroom door. She forgot to glance at Archie, and it was as well, perhaps, for his heart was thumping almost audibly as he waited for his Phebe. not from the anteroom, but out among the children where she had sat unseen in the shadow of the organ came stately Phebe in her wine-colored dress, with no ornament but her fine hair and a white flower at her throat. Very pale but quite composed, apparently, for she stepped slowly through the narrow lane of upturned faces, holding back her skirts lest they should rudely brush against some little head. Straight to the front she went, bowed hastily, and with a gesture to the accompanist, stood waiting to begin, her eyes fixed on the great gilt clock at the opposite end of the hall. They never wandered from that point while she sang, but as she ended they dropped for an instant on an eager girlish countenance bending from a front seat. Then with her hasty little bow she went quickly back among the children, who clapped and nodded as she passed, well pleased with the ballad she had sung. Everyone courteously followed their example, but there was no enthusiasm, and it was evident that Phebe had not produced a particular favorable impression. "Never sang so badly in her life," muttered Charlie irefully. "She was frightened, poor thing. Give her time," said Uncle Mac kindly. "I know she was, and I glared like a gorgon, but she never looked at me," added Steve, smoothing his gloves and his brows at the same time. "That first song was the hardest, and she got through much better than I expected," put in Dr. Alec, bound not to show the disappointment he felt. "Don't be troubled. Phoebe has courage enough for anything, and she'll astonish you before the evening's over," prophesied Mac with unabated confidence, for he knew something the rest did not. Rose said nothing, but under cover of her burnous, Brunous, gave Archie's hand a sympathetic squeeze, for his arms were unfolded now as if the strain was over, and one lay on his knee while the other he wiped his hot forehead with an air of relief. Friends about them murmured complimentary fibs and affected great delight and surprise at Miss Moore's charming style, exquisite simplicity, and undoubted talent, but strangers freely criticized, and Rose was so indignant at some of their remarks she could not listen to anything on stage. Though a fine overture was played, a man with a remarkable bass voice growled and roared melodiously, and the orphans sang a lively air with a chorus of tra-la-la, which was a great relief to little tongues unused to long silence. "I've often heard that women's tongues were hung in the middle and went at both ends, now I'm sure of it," whispered Charlie, trying to cheer her up by pointing out the comical effect of some 75 open mouths. And each of them the unruly member was wagging briskly. Rose laughed and let him fan her, leaning from the seat behind with the devoted air he always assumed in public. But her wounded feelings were not soothed, and she continued to frown at the stout man on the left, who had dared to say with a shrug and a glance at Phoebe's next piece, "That young woman can no more sing this Italian thing than she can fly. They ought not let her attempt it." Phoebe did, however, and suddenly changed the stout man's opinion by singing it grandly, for the consciousness of her first failure pricked her pride, and spurred her to do her best with the calm sort of determination which conquers fears, fires ambition, and changes defeat to success. She looked steadily at Rose now, or the flush-intent face beside her, and throwing all her soul into the task, let her voice ring out like a silver clarion, filling the great hall and setting the hearer's blood a-tingle with the exulting strain. That settled Phoebe's fate as a cantatress. The applause was genuine and spontaneous this time, and broke out again and again with a generous desire to atone for former coldness. But she would not return, and the shadow of the great organ seemed to have swallowed her up, for no one could find her, no pleasant clamor win her back. "Now I can die content," said Rose, beaming with heartfelt satisfaction, while Archie looked steadfastly at his program, trying to keep his face in order, and the rest of the family assumed a triumphant air as if they never doubted from the first. "Very well indeed," said the stout man with an approving nod. "Quite promising for a beginner. Shouldn't wonder if in time they made a second Carrie or Kellogg of her." "Now you'll forgive him, won't you?" murmured Charlie in his cousin's ear. "Yes, I'd like to pat him on the head, but take warning and never judge by first appearances again," whispered Rose, at peace now with all mankind. Phoebe's last song was another ballad. She meant to devote her talent to that much neglected but always attractive branch of her art. It was a great surprise, therefore, to all but one person in the hall, when instead of singing "Auld Robin Grey," she placed herself at the piano, and with a smiling glance over her shoulder at the children, broke out in the old bird song, which first won Rose. But the chirping, twittering, and cooing were now the burden to 3 verses of a charming little song, full of springtime and the awakening life that makes it lovely. A rippling accompaniment flowed through it all, and the burst of delighted laughter from the children filled up the first pause with a fitting answer to the voices that seemed calling to them from the vernal woods. It was very beautiful, and novelty lent its charm to the surprise, for art and nature worked a pretty miracle, and the clever imitation first heard from the kitchen hearth now became the favorite in a crowded concert room. Phoebe was quite herself again, color in the cheeks now, eyes that wandered smiling to and fro, and lips that sang as gaily and far more sweetly than when she kept time to her blithe music with a scrubbing brush. This song was evidently intended for the children, and they appreciated the kindly thoughts, for as Phoebe went back among them, they clapped ecstatically, flapping their pinafores, and some caught her up by the skirts with audible requests to "do it again, please, do it again." But Phoebe shook her head and vanished, for it was getting late for such small people, several of whom lay sweetly slumbering there, till roused by the clamor around them. The elders, however, were not to be denied, and applauded persistently, especially Aunt Plenty, who seized Uncle Mac's cane and pounded with it as vigorously as Mrs. Nubbles at the play. "Never mind your gloves, Steve. Keep it up till she comes," cried Charlie, enjoying the fun like a boy, while Jamie lost his head with excitement, and standing up called, "Phoebe, Phoebe," in spite of his mother's attempts to silence him. Even the stout man clapped, and Rose could only laugh delightedly as she turned to look at Archie, who seemed to have let himself loose at last and was stamping with a dogged energy funny to see. So Phoebe had to come, and stood there meekly bowing, with a moved look on her face that showed how glad and grateful she was, till a sudden hush came. Then, as if inspired by the memory of the cause that brought her there, she looked down into the sea of friendly faces before her with no trace of fear in her own, and sang the song that will never grow old, that went straight to the hearts of those who heard her, for there was something inexpressibly touching in the sight of the sweet-voiced woman singing of home for the lovely creatures who were homeless, and Phoebe made her tuneful plea irresistible by an almost involuntary gesture of the hands which had hung loosely clasped before her till, with the last echo of the beloved word, they fell apart and were half outstretched, as if pleading to be filled. It was the touch of nature that works wonders, for it made full purses suddenly weigh heavily, and pockets slow to open, brought tears to eyes unused to weep, and caused that group of red-gowned girls to grow very pathetic in the sight of fathers and mothers who had left little daughters safe asleep at home. This was evident from the stillness that remained unbroken for an instant after Phebe ended, and before people could get rid of their handkerchiefs. She would have been gone if the sudden appearance of a mite in a pinafore climbing up the stairs from the anteroom with a great bouquet grasped in both hands had not arrested her. Up came the little creature intent on performing the mission for which rich bribes of sugar plums had been promised, and trotting bravely across the stage, she held up the lovely nosegay, saying in her baby voice, "'Tis for you, ma'am." Then, startled by the sudden outburst of applause, she hid her face in Phoebe's gown and began to sob with fright. Hang on. Oh my gosh, this goes on and on and on. Lord have mercy. Why do I always forget my drink? Now I gotta get back to where okay. An awkward minute for poor Phoebe, but she showed unexpected presence of mind and left behind her a pretty picture of the oldest and youngest orphan, as she went quickly down the steps, smiling over the great bouquet with the baby on her arm. Nobody minded the closing piece, for people began to go, sleepy children to be carried off, and whispers grew into a buzz of conversation. In the general confusion, Rose looked to see if Steve had remembered his promise to help Phoebe slip away before the rush began. No, there he was, putting on Katie's cloak, quite oblivious to any other duty. Turning to ask Archie to hurry out, Rose found that he had already vanished, leaving his gloves behind him. "Have you lost anything?" asked Dr. Alec, catching a glimpse of her face. "No, sir, I found something," she whispered back, giving him the gloves to pocket along with the fan and glass, adding hastily as the concert ended, "Please, Uncle, tell them all not to come with us. Phoebe has had enough excitement not to rest." Rose's word was law to the family in all things concerning Phoebe. So word was passed that there were to be no congratulations until tomorrow, and Dr. Alec got his party off as soon as possible. But all the way home, while he and Aunt Plenty were prophesying a brilliant future for the singer, Rose sat rejoicing over the happy presence of the woman. She was sure that Archie had spoken and imagined the whole scene with feminine delight, how tenderly he had asked the momentous question, how gratefully Phoebe had given the desired reply, and now how both were enjoying that delicious hour which Rose had been given to understand never came but once. Such a pity to shorten it, she thought, and begged her uncle to go home the longest way. The night was so mild, the moonlight so clear, and herself so in need of fresh air after the excitement of the evening. "I thought you would want to rush into Phoebe's arms the instant she got done," said Aunt Plenty, innocently wondering at the whims girls took into their heads. "So I should if I consulted my own wishes. But as Phoebe asked to be let alone, I want to gratify her," answered Rose, making the best excuse she could. And I'm sorry, y'all. I was planning on reading longer, but golly gosh. I'll make sure to bring something to drink in next time. So there will be another part. Tell you what, these long chapters kill me. Only because I forget to bring something to drink. Or either I'm falling asleep, but I know my eyes are little because I hadn't been awake well, I was. I woke up about 6-ish, but then started stitching and of course went right to sleep. And Kim and Ginger are still on Affordably Geeky, but on Affordably Crafty Kim's channel until 11 o'clock. And then I think Mail comes on after that, and then one thing and another. And I'll be back at 3, and I'm going to try Restream, and y'all help me pray that works and I can understand it. I still have to I've tried to change the language on this darn Chrome, but oh my gosh. Anyway, be sweet, don't be ugly. See you back at 3. Love ya. Bye-bye.